$8,000 in $100 bills scattered across Interstate 40 like leaves in a windstorm. That's what truck driver Joe Mitchell saw in his rearview mirror at 9:47 a.m. on September 16, 1971, just outside Memphis. He'd been driving for 16 hours straight, hauling freight from Little Rock to Nashville, when something black flew off the car ahead of him and exploded on impact with the highway. At first, Joe thought it was a briefcase. Then he saw the money. Bills everywhere, spinning in the wind, sticking to the asphalt, blowing into the grass on the roadside. Joe hit his brakes, pulled his 18-wheeler onto the shoulder, and sat there for a moment, watching through his dusty windshield as $100 bills danced in the September morning sun. He was 43 years old, owned a small trucking company that was failing, had a wife with medical bills he couldn't pay, and exactly 14 days before the bank foreclosed on his house. $8,000 was more money than Joe had seen in one place in his entire life. $8,000 could save everything he was about to lose. $8,000 was sitting on the highway, unclaimed, with nobody around to see what he did next. Joe opened his truck door and stepped out onto the shoulder of Interstate, and what he did in the next 10 minutes would prove that some things matter more than money, and that honesty, even when nobody's watching, creates ripples that change lives in ways we never expect. But to understand why Joe Mitchell made the choice he did that morning, you need to know about the promise his father made him keep on a hospital bed in 1968, 3 years before this moment. Because that promise was about to be tested in a way neither of them could have imagined. It was a clear September morning, the kind where the Tennessee sky stretched blue and endless in every direction. Joe Mitchell had left Little Rock at 5 p.m. the previous evening, driving through the night to make his delivery deadline in Nashville by noon. His truck was loaded with furniture, 2,000 pounds of it, and he was running on coffee and determination. Joe Mitchell was not a large man, 5'9", maybe 160 pounds, with calloused hands and tired eyes that had seen too many long highways and not enough sleep. He wore faded blue jeans, a plaid shirt with worn elbows, and work boots that had been resoled twice because he couldn't afford new ones. His face was weathered from years of driving with the window down, and his hair, once dark brown, was starting to show gray at the temple. But what you couldn't see from looking at Joe was that he was drowning. His small trucking company, Mitchell Freight Services, which he'd started with his father in 1965, was barely surviving. His father had died 3 years ago, and without him, Joe had struggled to keep the business afloat. He'd lost 2 of his 3 trucks to repossession last year. He'd been forced to let go of his only employee, his cousin Danny, because he couldn't make payroll. Now it was just Joe, 1 truck, and a mountain of debt that got higher every month. His wife Mary had been diagnosed with diabetes 2 years ago. The medication she needed cost more than their grocery budget. They'd sold Mary's car. They'd stopped going to church because Mary was too ashamed to wear the same dress every Sunday. They'd told their 2 kids, Tommy and Sarah, that Christmas might be small this year, which was code for might not happen at all. And 2 weeks ago, Joe had received the letter, final notice of foreclosure. The house they'd lived in for 12 years, where Tommy and Sarah had grown up, where Joe's father had spent his last Christmas, was going to be taken by the bank on September 30th, unless Joe could come up with $3,800. Joe had tried everything. He'd gone to the bank and begged for an extension, denied. He'd applied for a loan from 3 different places, rejected. He'd asked his brother for help. His brother was struggling too. He'd even considered selling his truck, but it was worth less than he owed on it, and without the truck, he had no way to earn money at all. So on the morning of September 16, 1971, Joe Mitchell was driving toward Nashville with his entire world collapsing around him, praying for a miracle he didn't really believe would come. And then he saw the money. The car ahead of him was a Cadillac, black and shiny, with Tennessee plate. It was moving fast, maybe 75 miles an hour in a 65 zone. Joe had been following it for about 10 miles, keeping a safe distance, when something flew off the roof of the Cadillac. At first, Joe thought it was a briefcase It tumbled through the air, spinning, and when it hit the highway, it burst open like a piñata. $100 bills exploded into the air. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They caught the wind and scattered in every direction. Some landing on the highway, some flying into the grass, some sticking to Joe's windshield as he drove through the cloud of money. The Cadillac didn't stop. Maybe the driver didn't note. Maybe they were too far ahead to see what had happened. The car just kept going, getting smaller and smaller, until it disappeared around a curve in the highway. Joe hit his brakes. His truck shuddered and groaned as he pulled onto the shoulder. Heart pounding, mind racing. He sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what he'd just seen. Money. Actual money. $100 bills, scattered across Interstate 40 like someone had made it rain in the middle of Tennessee. Joe looked in his rearview mirror. The highway stretched empty behind him. He looked ahead. No cars coming. He was alone on this stretch of highway. Alone with more money than he'd seen in his entire life. Money that nobody was claiming. Money that could solve every problem he had. His hands were shaking as he opened the truck door and stepped down onto the shoulder. The morning sun was warm on his face. The air smelled like diesel and hot asphalt. And everywhere he looked there was money. Joe walked slowly onto the highway, his work boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. He picked up the first bill he reached. It was a $100 bill, crisp and new, with Benjamin Franklin's face staring up at him. Joe held it in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the texture of the paper, the reality of what he was holding. $100. That was 2 weeks of groceries. That was Mary's medication for a month. That was Tommy's school supplies for the year. Joe stood there in the middle of Interstate 40, holding that single bill, and the weight of his entire life pressed down on him. He thought about last Tuesday night, when Mary had cried because she'd had to water down the milk to make it last longer. He thought about Tommy asking why they couldn't go to the movies anymore like they used to. He thought about Sarah's shoes with the cardboard insert covering the hole in the sole, and how she'd told her teacher she liked them that way, didn't want new ones, because she knew they couldn't afford it. He thought about the envelope that had arrived yesterday from the electric company. Final notice, pay or disconnect. Joe had $43 in his checking account. The bill was $87. He thought about the conversation he'd had with Mary 3 nights ago, when she'd suggested maybe she could get a job. And Joe had seen the shame in her eyes because they both knew that with her diabetes and her energy levels, she could barely manage the house, let alone work outside it. And he'd felt like a failure because he was supposed to be the provider, the one who kept everything together. And he was failing at the most basic task of keeping his family fed and housed. $100 in his hand, and dozens more scattered across the highway. Joe looked around again. Still no cars, still nobody watching. The morning sun was climbing higher, and heat was starting to shimmer off the asphalt. A crow cawed from somewhere in the distance. Otherwise, silent. He could take this money. He could take all of it, and nobody would ever know. Joe bent down and picked up another bill, and another. He moved across the highway like a man in a trance, collecting the scattered money, his mind spinning through justifications and arguments and desperate bargains with God. Maybe this is meant to be, he thought. Maybe God put this money here for me. Maybe this is the miracle I've been praying for. Finders keepers, right? This money was abandoned. Nobody's claiming it. If I don't take it, someone else will. Or it'll just blow away and be lost forever. At least I'll use it for good things, to help my family, to keep a roof over my kids' heads. That's not wrong. That can't be wrong. But even as these thoughts ran through his head, Joe could hear his father's voice, clear as if Robert Mitchell was standing right there on the highway with him. Son, you know the difference between a reason and an excuse. A reason is why you should do something. An excuse is why you shouldn't feel bad about doing something you know is wrong. Right now, you're making excuses. Joe paused, a handful of bills in his hand. He closed his eyes against the sun and the shame and the desperate need that was trying to convince him that taking this money would be okay. He thought about his father's face in that hospital bed, gaunt and gray, dying but still teaching. Still trying to make sure Joe understood what mattered. Listen to me, son. His father's voice was weak but urgent. There's gonna come a time when you're faced with a choice. A hard choice. When doing the right thing will cost you something you can't afford to lose. When being honest will hurt. When keeping your word will break you. And in that moment, you're going to have to decide who you are. Are you a man of integrity? Or are you just a man who acts with integrity when it's convenient? I don't know if I'm that strong, Dad, Joe had said, holding his father's hand. You are. You will be. Because I raised you right, and because you'll remember this conversation. You'll remember that I believed in you. And you'll do the right thing not because it's easy, but because it's who you are. Joe opened his eyes and looked at the money in his hand. He looked at the plastic grocery bag he'd brought from his truck, now half full of $100 bills. He looked up and down the empty highway at the sky that seemed too blue for such a gray moment, at the world that kept spinning regardless of his crisis. And Joe Mitchell made a decision. He kept collecting the money, every bill he could find, every scrap of currency scattered across Interstate 40. He collected it all methodically, carefully, his hands still shaking but his mind becoming clearer with each bill he picked up. Because Joe had realized something. This wasn't his test. This wasn't his miracle. This money belonged to someone, and Joe was going to find out who and return every dollar, even if it killed him to do it. Even if it meant losing everything. Even if his family never understood. Because his father was right. Integrity is all you really own, and Joe Mitchell was not going to give his away, no matter the price. It took him about 20 minutes to collect all the money he could find. Some bills were caught in the roadside weeds. Some were floating in a drainage ditch, 20 feet from the highway. Some were tangled in the barbed wire fence that ran along the road. Joe retrieved every one he could see, stuffing them into the plastic bag, refusing to count them, refusing to calculate how much this honesty was costing him. When he finished, Joe stood on the shoulder, holding that bag, and he felt simultaneously like the biggest fool in Tennessee, and like maybe somehow he was going to be okay. Not financially okay. He was still going to lose his house. Mary still needed medication. The kids still needed things he couldn't provide. But he was going to be okay with himself. He was going to be able to look in the mirror. He was going to be able to tell Tommy and Sarah someday that their father, when tested, had chosen character over convenience. That had to count for something, even if right now it didn't feel like it counted for enough. When he finished, Joe stood on the shoulder of Interstate 40, holding a plastic bag full of cash. And for the first time since his father died, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things might be okay. He didn't count it exactly, but he estimated there was at least $7,000 or $8,000 in that bag. More than enough to save his house, enough to pay Mary's medical bills, enough to buy Christmas presents for the kids, enough to breathe again. Joe walked back toward his truck, his mind already planning how he'd use the money. Pay the bank first. That was priority one. Then Mary's medication. Then maybe, if there was enough left, get the truck's transmission looked at, because it had been making a grinding noise that worried him. He was 3 feet from his truck when he saw it. A black leather wallet, lying on the white line that marked the edge of the shoulder. Joe almost didn't notice it. It blended in with the asphalt, worn and dark, but something made him look down, and there it was. Joe picked up the wallet. It was expensive. He could tell that immediately. Soft leather, well made, the kind of wallet that cost more than Joe spent on groceries in a month. He opened it, looking for identification, and that's when he saw the name embossed on the inside in gold letters. Elvis A. Presley. Joe stood there, wallet in one hand, plastic bag full of money in the other, and felt his heart sink into his work boots. Elvis Presley. The Elvis Presley, the biggest star in the world. This wasn't just found money. This was Elvis Presley's money. And Joe Mitchell, honest man that he was, knew exactly what he had to do. But knowing what you should do and wanting to do it are two very different things. Joe stood on that highway shoulder for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10, having an argument with himself that nobody else could hear. One part of him, the desperate part, the part that was terrified of losing his house and failing his family, was saying nobody saw you. Nobody knows. Elvis Presley is rich. He won't miss $8,000. You need it. Your family needs it. God put this money in your path for a reason. Take it. Keep it. Save your family. But another part of him, The part that sounded exactly like his father's voice was saying something different. Your word is your bond, son. Your integrity is all you really own. Nobody can take it from you. You can only give it away, and once you give it away, you never get it back. Joe's father, Robert Mitchell, had been a truck driver too. He'd taught Joe everything about the business. How to handle an 18-wheeler in bad weather, how to read a load schedule, how to negotiate with dispatchers, how to stay awake on long hauls. But more than that, he'd taught Joe about character. Joe remembered a day in 1966 when he was working with his father on a delivery to Atlanta. They'd stopped for lunch at a diner, and the waitress had given them too much change by mistake. $20 too much. Joe's father had noticed immediately and called the waitress back to return the money. Joe had asked him why. They don't pay her enough anyway, Joe had said. She probably won't even notice. His father had looked at him with those serious eyes that meant a lecture was coming. Son, he'd said, honesty isn't about whether people notice or whether they'll miss the money. Honesty is about who you are when nobody's looking. It's about being able to look at yourself in the mirror and know that you're the kind of man who does the right thing, even when the wrong thing is easier and nobody would know the difference. 3 years ago in the hospital, when Joe's father was dying from the cancer that had eaten through his lungs, he'd made Joe promise him something. Promise me you'll stay honest, his father had said, his voice weak, his hand gripping Joe's with surprising strength. I know things are hard. I know the business is struggling. I know you're scared about money. But promise me you won't compromise your integrity. Not for anything. Not for anyone. Your integrity is your legacy. It's what you'll pass on to Tommy and Sarah. Don't give it away for money, son. No amount of money is worth losing who you are. Joe had promised, standing in that hospital room, watching his father struggle for breath. Joe had promised he would stay honest no matter what. And now, standing on Interstate 40 with Elvis Presley's wallet in one hand and $8,000 in the other, with 14 days until foreclosure and no other options in sight, Joe Mitchell was being asked to keep that promise. It was the hardest decision of his life. Joe stood there for so long that 2 cars passed him, slowing down to see if he needed help. He waved them on, pretending he was just checking his truck. When they were gone, when he was alone again, Joe Mitchell made his choice. He put the plastic bag full of money in his truck. He put Elvis's wallet in his pocket, and he got back on the highway, heading toward Memphis instead of Nashville, because the wallet had an address, and Joe Mitchell was going to return every dollar no matter what it cost him. The address in the wallet said Graceland, 3764 Elvis Presley Boulevard, Memphis, Tennessee. Joe had heard of Graceland, of course. Everyone had. It was Elvis's mansion, the famous estate where he lived. Joe had never been there, never had any reason to go, but he knew roughly where it was. It took him 45 minutes to reach Memphis, fighting through morning traffic, his mind spinning the whole way. He kept thinking about Mary, about the kids, about the house. He kept thinking about how easy it would be to just throw the wallet in a dumpster and keep the money. Nobody would know. Nobody would connect him to it. He could save his family and nobody would ever find out. But then he'd hear his father's voice again. Your integrity is all you really own. You can only give it away. Joe pulled up to the gates of Graceland. The famous music note gates were closed, and there was a guardhouse with a security guard inside. Joe parked his truck on the street, grabbed the wallet and the plastic bag of money, and walked up to the gate. The security guard, a middle-aged man in a uniform, looked at Joe with suspicion. Joe knew how he must look. Unshaven, exhausted, wearing work clothes that had seen better days, carrying a plastic grocery bag. Can I help you? The guard asked, his tone making it clear that Joe probably didn't belong here. I found something that belongs to Presley, Joe said, holding up the wallet. Found it on Interstate 40 about an hour ago. I'd like to return it to him. The guard's expression changed from suspicion to shock. He leaned forward, looking at the wallet. Is that Elvis A. Presley? Joe confirmed, showing him the name embossed inside. And there's money too. A lot of money. It was scattered all over the highway. I collected as much as I could find. The guard stared at Joe for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was real or some kind of elaborate prank. Then he picked up a phone in the guardhouse and made a call. Joe stood there, waiting, the September sun getting warmer, sweat starting to form on his forehead. He thought about Mary at home, probably calling the bank again, begging for more time. He thought about Tommy and Sarah at school, unaware that their whole world might change in 2 weeks. He thought about how easy it would still be to just turn around, walk back to his truck, and drive away. But he stayed. After about 5 minutes, the guard hung up the phone and opened the gate. "Mr. Presley wants to see you himself," the guard said, his voice now respectful. "Pull your truck up to the main house. Someone will meet you there." Joe drove his truck through the famous gates of Graceland, his heart pounding. He'd never met a celebrity before. He'd certainly never been to a mansion. The driveway curved up to a white columned house that looked like something from a movie. The lawn was perfectly manicured. There were fountains and statues and more luxury than Joe had ever seen in one place. He parked his truck in front of the house, feeling suddenly very aware of how out of place he was. A man in a nice shirt came out to meet him, introduced himself as Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager. "Mr. Presley is very grateful you returned his wallet," Joe Esposito said. "He'd like to thank you personally. Please, come inside." Joe followed him into Graceland, carrying the plastic bag of money and the wallet. The inside of the house was even more impressive than the outside. Gold records on the walls, expensive furniture, a staircase that curved up to the second floor. Everything spoke of wealth and success, and a life that was completely foreign to Joe Mitchell's experience. Elvis was waiting in a sitting room off the main hallway. He stood when Joe entered, and Joe was struck by how normal he looked. No stage costume, no elaborate hair, just a regular guy in casual clothes, looking concerned and curious. "You're the one who found my wallet?" Elvis asked, extending his hand. Joe shook it, his work-rough hand meeting Elvis's softer one. "Yes, sir. Found it on Interstate 40 this morning. The wallet and this money." Joe held up the plastic bag. "It was scattered all over the highway. Must have fallen off your car or something." Elvis looked at the bag, then at Joe, then back at the bag. "You collected all of this from the highway?" "Yes, sir. Took me about 20 minutes. There might be more out there that I missed, but I got as much as I could see." Elvis took the bag and looked inside. His eyes widened. "There's got to be $8, maybe $9,000 here." "Something like that," Joe said. "I didn't count it exactly. Didn't feel right to count money that wasn't mine." Elvis stared at Joe for a long moment, then gestured to a chair. "Sit down, please. I want to talk to you." "Sir, I really should get going," Joe started. "I've got a delivery." "Sit down," Elvis repeated, his voice gentle but firm. "Please, just for a few minutes." Joe sat awkwardly on the edge of an expensive-looking chair, acutely aware of his dirty work clothes, and the way he probably smelled after 16 hours in a truck. Elvis sat across from him, still holding the bag of money, studying Joe with an intensity that made Joe uncomfortable. "You found $9,000 on a highway," Elvis said slowly. "Collecting it all. Figured out it was mine. Drove 45 minutes out of your way to return it. And you didn't count it?" "No, sir," Joe said simply. "It's not my money. Wouldn't be right. Most people would have kept this," Elvis said. "You know that, right? Most people would have seen this as a gift from God. Found money. Nobody's fault. Nobody would ever know." "I'd know," Joe said quietly. Elvis leaned back in his chair, a slight smile on his face. "Your father taught you well." "He taught me that character is who you are when nobody's watching," Joe said. "That integrity is the only thing you really own, that you can only give it away. And once you give it away, you can never get it back." "Tell me about your father," Elvis said. So Joe, he told Elvis about Robert Mitchell, about the lifetime of truck driving, about the lessons taught on long hauls and in greasy diners. He told him about the day with the waitress and the wrong change. He told him about the hospital room and the promise. "He made me promise I'd stay honest no matter what," Joe said, his voice thick with emotion. "He knew things were going to be hard after he was gone. He knew I'd be tempted, but he made me promise that I wouldn't compromise my integrity for money, or convenience, or because times were tough. And you kept that promise," Elvis said. "Even today." "Even though," Elvis paused, looking at Joe more carefully, taking in the worn clothes, the exhaustion, the wedding ring with missing stones, the work boots that had been resold multiple times. "Even though you clearly need this money yourself," Elvis finished. Joe didn't respond. There wasn't really anything to say to that. "Joe, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "Elvis, are you in financial trouble?" Joe's pride wanted to say no, but sitting across from Elvis Presley in this expensive room, having just returned $9,000 he desperately needed, Joe found he didn't have the energy for pride anymore. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I'm in trouble. Tell me," Elvis said simply. So Joe told him. He told him about the failing trucking company, about Mary's diabetes and the medication they couldn't afford, about Tommy and Sarah and the shoes with holes and the watered-down milk. He told him about the foreclosure notice, about the 14 days, about the $3,800 he didn't have and couldn't get. "I've tried everything," Joe said. "I've begged the bank for extensions, signed for loans everywhere, asked family for help. Nobody has anything to give. I'm out of options. In 2 weeks, my family loses our home, and there's nothing I can do about it." "But you could have done something," Elvis said softly. 45 minutes ago, you could have solved every problem you just described. You were holding the solution in your hands, and you chose to return it instead." "It wasn't mine to keep," Joe said. "Even though keeping it would have saved your family?" "Even though," Joe confirmed. Elvis was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Joe, I need to tell you something I don't talk about much." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "When I was growing up, we were poor, not struggling poor, not making ends meet poor, desperately, crushingly poor. There were times we didn't have food, times my mama would go hungry so I could eat, times we were one day away from being homeless." Elvis's voice grew soft with memory. "And I remember my father coming home one day when I was about 12. He'd found a wallet. Someone had dropped it downtown and my daddy found it. There was $200 in that wallet. $200. That was more money than we'd see in 6 months back then." Joe listened, understanding where this was going. "My daddy stood in our kitchen holding that wallet, and I could see him thinking. I could see the temptation. I could see him calculating how many meals that $200 would buy, how many bills it would pay. And my mama, she was looking at that money like it was the answer to her prayers." "What did he do?" Joe asked. "He looked up the address in the wallet." Elvis found out it belonged to a businessman from out of town who was staying at a hotel downtown. "My daddy walked 5 miles to that hotel and returned the wallet with every dollar in it. The man tried to give him a reward. My daddy refused." Elvis smiled at the memory. "I asked him later why he'd done it, why he'd returned money we needed so badly. And you know what he said?" "What?" Joe asked. "He said, son, that money wasn't ours. Taking it would have made us thieves. I'd rather be poor and honest than comfortable and crooked. And I need you to learn that lesson now, because someday you might have money and power, and you'll need to remember that those things don't define you. Your character defines you, and character is built in moments like this, when nobody's watching and nobody would know the difference." Joe felt tears start to burn behind his eyes. It was almost exactly what his own father had taught him. "My daddy died when I was 18, Elvis continued. "But I never forgot that lesson. And when I started making money, real money, I promised myself I'd use it to help people who were in the position my family used to be in. People who were doing the right thing even when it cost them everything." Elvis stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn. "Joe, what you did today wasn't just returning my money. You reminded me why that lesson mattered. You showed me that integrity still exists in the world, that there are still people who keep their promises even when it breaks them, and I want to honor that." "Sir, I didn't return your money for a reward," Joe said quickly. "I know you didn't," Elvis said, turning back to face him. "That's exactly why you deserve one. But more than that, you need one, and I have the ability to help. So I'm going to ask you to let me." Elvis was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Joe, give me your address and the name of your bank." "Sir, I don't want charity," Joe said immediately. "It's not charity," Elvis said. "It's investment. I'm investing in integrity, in a world that needs more people like you. Now give me your information, and then go make your delivery in Nashville. And Joe, don't mention this to anyone, promise me." Joe didn't understand, but he gave Elvis his home address and the name of his bank. They shook hands one more time and Joe left Graceland, drove to Nashville, made his delivery 4 hours late, and went home expecting to lose everything in 2 weeks. But 3 days later, on September 19, 1971, Joe Mitchell received a call from his bank. The caller sounded confused. Miss Mitchell, I'm calling about your mortgage account. There seems to have been a payment made. What kind of payment? Joe asked, his heart starting to race. A full payment, sir. Your mortgage has been paid in full. The house is yours, free and clear. Joe stood in his living room, phone in his hand, unable to speak. Mary was looking at him with concern, asking what was wrong. But Joe couldn't answer because he was starting to understand what Elvis had done. The next day, another call came, this time from a medical billing office. Miss Mitchell's account has been paid in full, they said. All outstanding balances cleared. And the day after that, a certified check arrived in the mail, made out to Mitchell Freight Services, for $15,000, enough to pay off the truck, fix the transmission, and keep the business running for 6 months. The note attached said only, "Investment in integrity." No signature. Joe Mitchell sat at his kitchen table, holding that check, and he cried. Mary sat beside him, also crying, not fully understanding what had happened, but understanding that somehow, impossibly, they'd been saved. But Elvis didn't stop there. Over the next month, Joe received 3 jobs from high-paying clients who'd been referred to him by someone they wouldn't name. His business began to turn around. Within 6 months, he was able to hire back his cousin Danny. Within a year, he'd bought a second truck. Joe never told anyone what had happened. He'd promised Elvis, and Joe Mitchell kept his promises. But every time someone asked him about his success, about how he'd turned his business around, Joe would say the same thing. I made a choice to do the right thing, even when it was hard. And integrity has a way of creating opportunities you never expect. In 1977, when Elvis died, Joe Mitchell attended the public viewing at Graceland. He stood in line for 4 hours with thousands of other people. And when he finally reached the casket, he leaned close and whispered, "Thank you for seeing my integrity when I couldn't afford to prove it. You saved my family. And you showed me that sometimes doing the right thing does get rewarded, just not always in the ways we expect." Joe Mitchell ran his trucking company successfully for another 23 years. He hired veterans who couldn't find work. He gave second chances to people who'd made mistakes. He paid fair wages and treated his employees with respect. And every time he hired someone new, he told them the story of integrity. It's all you really own. You can only give it away, and once you give it away, you never get it back. His son Tommy took over the business in 2000, and by then Mitchell Freight Services had grown to 15 trucks and 40 employees. On the wall of Tommy's office hung a framed newspaper clipping from 1977, Elvis's obituary, and next to it, a handwritten note that said, "Integrity rewarded. Thank you, EP." Today, Mitchell Freight Services is one of the most respected trucking companies in Tennessee. They're known for their honesty, their reliability, and their commitment to doing the right thing, even when it costs. And every new employee receives a copy of Joe Mitchell's integrity policy, which reads, "Your word is your bond. Your integrity is all you really own. Do the right thing, even when nobody's watching, especially when nobody's watching." Joe Mitchell died in 2015 at the age of 8. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched, and on his gravestone, at his request, are the words his father taught him: "Integrity is all you own." The story of Joe Mitchell and Elvis Presley is a reminder that character is tested in moments when no one is watching, when keeping your integrity costs you everything, and when doing the right thing seems impossible. It's a reminder that honesty, even when it's hard, even when it costs you, even when nobody would know if you lied, creates ripples that spread far beyond one moment. Because Joe Mitchell's choice to return that money didn't just save his family, it showed his children what integrity looks like. It built a business based on trust and honesty. It created a company culture that still values doing the right thing over making the quick buck. And it proved that sometimes when you choose character over convenience, the universe has a way of noticing. Elvis Presley met thousands of people during his life, but he never forgot Joe Mitchell, the truck driver who returned $9,000 he desperately needed because it was the right thing to do. And Joe Mitchell never forgot Elvis, the celebrity who could have just taken his wallet and moved on, but instead chose to reward integrity in a way that changed a family's entire future. This is the story of 2 men who understood something profound. That wealth isn't measured by money, but by character. That real power is using what you have to help others. And that integrity, once proven, creates bonds that transcend class and circumstance. And celebrity. When you're faced with a choice between what you need and what's right, remember Joe Mitchell standing on Interstate 40 with a plastic bag full of money and a promise to his father. Remember that integrity is all you really own, and that once you give it away, you never get it back. And remember that sometimes, doing the right thing costs you everything in the moment, but pays dividends for the rest of your life, because that's what Joe Mitchell proved on September 16, and that the hardest choices often lead to the best outcomes, even when you can't see them coming.